Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. Today I'm pleased to have as my guest the acclaimed novelist and scholar A.S. Byatt. A.S. Byatt is the author of dozens of novels, stories, and critical works. Her best-selling novel, Possession, won the Man Booker Prize in 1990, and this is Britain's highest literary award. Her most recent novel, The Children's Book, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, has just been published in this country. Her erudition and her imagination are, I have to say, astonishing, and I'm honored to have her as our guest. A.S. Byatt, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you for asking me.
Well, your name is Antonia Susan Byatt, but you use the initials A.S., and I wonder about this. Is this a 19th century thing?
Well, it's later than the 19th century. It seemed to me natural at the time. People were always asking. There was T.S. Eliot, and there was D.H. Lawrence, and there was H.G. Wells, and our greatest detective story writer was D.L. Sayers. She published as that. So it didn't strike me as very odd, and I rather like it I like the idea of the impersonality of the artist, which is a T.S. Eliot idea.
Well, that is also the 19th century notion that the woman needs to efface her femaleness.
I don't think I was doing that. And by the time I first published, there were a lot of very, very good women novelists, and I think there wasn't a problem. In fact, paradoxically, I think there's now more of a problem for being taken seriously if you're a woman writer than there was when I started publishing.
Why do you say that?
This is getting me into deep water. I think literary feminism has had a bad effect on women's writing. I think it's had a good effect on study in many ways, and feminism has had a very good effect on our lives. But there has started being a thing like the woman's novel of my childhood again. And somehow, certainly in Britain, when I began to write, the great novelists were women. There was Muriel Spark, there was Iris Murdoch, and there was, though we didn't know at the time how great she was, Penelope Fitzgerald. There was Doris Lessing. They were equal with the men and were talked about equally. You had William Golding, Anthony Burgess. They were better, the women, than writers like Kingsley Amis, in my view.
I agree.
And then when we got feminism, women became much more consciously to write about women. And the men became very flamboyant. And we got Martin Amis and Ian McEwan. And the women went rather quiet and withdrew somehow. And I wouldn't have expected this to happen, but I observed it happening.
That's so interesting. And I wonder, you blame this to some extent on feminism?
Literary feminism.
Because of the success that women had to a certain extent?
Because there was so much theorizing about writing by women. And
it became a niche then.
It became a niche.
I see.
And you shouldn't, a really great writer isn't writing in a niche. That's not even true. Some of them, I'm sure, if I started thinking about it, are writing in niches. P.G. Wodehouse, for instance, was in his own niche. But it became a niche, and it became a kind of program. There were things you had to do, and things you could say, and things you shouldn't say. And it wasn't just writing.
Okay. Well, we'll probably get more onto this as we talk more about your writing. But I want to talk for a moment about your education, which is interesting to me. You were an undergraduate. Now, perhaps I'll get this order wrong, but my sense is you were an undergraduate at Cambridge. Then you spent some time at Bryn Mawr,
yes.
here in the States, right around the corner, and then at Oxford for postgraduate work. That's quite a hefty education. And you taught for a while at the University of London. Did you think of yourself initially as a scholar before you became a novelist?
I knew I could be a good scholar. I was very uncertain as to whether I could be a good novelist. I knew I could make a living as a university teacher of some kind because, I had been successful enough and I enjoyed it and I enjoyed the scholarship, and I was rather surprised to find I intensely enjoyed teaching. But it was never my first wish or what I really wanted to do. I was never not writing a novel, even when I was a student.
I see.
I wrote novels all the way through lectures. I was listening to lectures and writing novels.
This is really unusual in a sense, because often those two worlds are distinct. The academic world, writing about literature, and the literary person. And you are unique in some ways, I think, in combining the two. Did you feel that you were unusual? Did you feel apart from your peers in that respect?
Yes, I do feel apart. I still do, in fact. There is a strong tradition, well, I think both in the United States and in Britain, of writing university novels. But in Britain, anyway, they tend to be farces. If you are Malcolm Bradbury or David Lodge, you send up the life of the mind. So anybody in a university is having dreadful accidents with teapots and falling downstairs and getting into embarrassments with their clothes. And
very male, too.
Very male.
Yeah.
And they don't do any work. And they don't think very much. And
it's
if they do think,
it's
they're
the
mocked.
trappings more than the ideas.
Yes.
Yes.
And I actually think that the life of the mind is an amazing and wonderful and interesting thing. And if you're going to write novels, why not put it in? I'm just reading a novel by Iris Murdoch at the moment, which has got nothing but it in, and that's beginning to distress me as well.
So there can be too much in.
There can be too much.
And I guess that balance is the balance that you seek in your writing.
Yes, I want to write about whole human beings, and human beings think as well as feeling. And after many years of experience, I've understood that the novel is primarily about feelings, whether or not you want it to be. But there are novels which I love intensely, which are about people thinking as well as feeling, and working as well as having relationships. And
Well, that's interesting. Do you feel that you started out, and I do want to talk about your quartet of novels, the Frederica Potter novels written between, I guess, 1978 and 2002, which I guess started as early work and then became more recent. Did you feel you went through a progression where you were more idea-centered and then moved to more feeling-centered sorts of stories?
I don't think I did. I think I just began to observe the world I was writing into as people read what I wrote. I think I was trying to write both in the quartet, which is my own contemporaries as the characters, and in Possession, which is people younger than me and people in history, and in the children's book. I was partly at least writing about how women could reconcile being sexually women and possibly having children with the life of the mind.
Well, starting with the Frederica Potter then, which is contemporary with you and deals largely in the 60s, which would have been your coming of age period. Tell us a little bit about dealing with that period in your fiction. You lived through it, but then it's interesting that you then went back and wrote about it, and I wonder if there was a difference having lived through it and then going back and imagining it.
I didn't mean to go back. I meant to sort of start. Well, I think I decided to start writing it in about 1970, and I thought I would write from 1953, which was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, and stop in 1970, in which I think Harold Wilson was elected as Prime Minister. And I thought I would follow my characters very, very closely during that time. I remember thinking with a kind of glee, I'm getting quite old. I've now lived, I must have been 25. I thought, I've lived through some history. I can actually write about my own time as though it was history. And I think a lot of the rest of the quartet's structure was me needing something that I could write and have small children and earn my living. So it had to be a long thing that was always ongoing. And because I have a naturally structural mind, it started having a very complicated aesthetic structure before it was written at all.
So it was meant to be 4 books from the beginning?
Yes, it was always meant to be 4. And the first one was meant to be a realistic novel about 1953, but with echoes of the first Elizabethan England, a sort of structure of metaphors and ideas from there. And then the second two were meant to be more experimental than they were. The second one was called Still Life and was largely about the life of the body, birth, marriage, and death. And the third one was called Babel Tower and was about language going mad in the world, which is how I experienced the 1960s. Everybody began to speak private languages that didn't speak to each other. And
would you say Babel Tower was an experimental novel?
it was meant to be more experimental than it is, but it plays certain games with the nature of language. And then A Whistling Woman was meant to put it all together again so that the language and the body were in a kind of George. I had the idea that the fourth book would be like George Eliot. And the first book was sort of aiming towards George Eliot, and the fourth book
You'd culminate with a
true
Eliot
with a George
novel.
Eliot sort of breadth of experience. But of course what happened, the whole of this idea was before the 1960s happened, in the sense that the 1960s happened on the whole at the beginning of the 1970s. What we call the 60s was mostly in the early 70s, you know, the real revolutions, rebellions, anti-universities and things like that. And in fact, I was writing a novel alongside my life, rather like Proust, who was, come to think of it, more of a model in my mind at that time than George Eliot. I thought I can behave like Proust and just keep the novel going, whatever else
Simultaneous
I'm doing
with your life.
With my life, yes.
I'm surprised you didn't go mad.
I very nearly did several times. On the other hand, I go mad if I'm not writing.
Well, I get that sense, and I want to get to that. But first, you know, you've mentioned already so many figures, literary figures, and I want to ask you, I mean, when I read you, what comes to mind are just Dickens, Henry James, George Eliot, her baggy monsters, and you have novels that are so large and so baggy in some ways, but also the poets, Christina Rossetti, Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, and so forth, John Donne also going back. I wonder about these figures and how they figure for you. What kind of influence, perhaps you could talk about one or two and their importance for you, your imagination.
Where to begin?
Where to begin? Who would you say, if I said to you, you had to choose one that was most influential, who would that be?
It would be a very platitudinous thing, but it would be Shakespeare. Because my head is full of having learned most of Shakespeare by heart when I was a schoolgirl and an undergraduate. And when I'm thinking, lines of him start rushing through my head. And the glory of him is the freedom of his language. You never feel that he was constrained or stuck. If he wanted to say something, he could say it. And he's an immensely liberating presence for a writer, I think. You know, you just keep going, you keep writing, and you'll find the right word. And so there's him first, and then going forward from him, George Eliot.
Yeah.
And I've recently discovered Balzac. But you can't say he's an influence because I didn't know him when I was young enough.
He will influence you, let's put it
He will,
that.
yes.
Yeah.
I'm writing about him and lecturing about him a bit. And Proust was a sort of huge influence when I discovered him, which was really when I was a postgraduate student. I had an argument with my supervisor of my thesis, and she said to me very, very kindly, she said at the end of the interview, she said, I'm now going away, I'm reading Proust, but of course I can't read him in French. So I thought, right. I went to the bookshop and I bought Proust in French. And in fact, that was the moment I stopped writing the thesis.